Welcome to a special presentation from the Rosalind Franklin Society. I'm the Executive Director, Karla Shepard Rubinger, and our mission is to support and showcase women in science. Our board is made up of prestigious women and men in science who share this mission, including 5 Nobel laureates. Please visit our website to access previous webinars, our annual conference, and our biweekly newsletter. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to an impressive champion of women who persist and pursue their passions, Chelsea Clinton. Of course, we all know her as the President's daughter, the Secretary of State's travel companion, and the front row seat for a senator from New York. But she now harbors a BA from Stanford, an MPH from Columbia, a DPhil from Oxford, and a husband, 3 children, and a dog in New York City. And she carries on the family traditions of public interest and leadership. This currently takes the form of a new children's book series entitled She Persisted. The most recent in the series, She Persisted in Science, is of special interest to the Rosalind Franklin Society. It features several women scientists, famous and not so famous, and notably includes Rosalind Franklin. Here is our special opportunity to meet a woman who persists and encourages others to do the same. She will be interviewed by Julianna LeMieux, Senior Science Editor at Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News. Julianna has a PhD in molecular biology and a postdoc from MIT. Clearly, she persisted too. The floor is yours, ladies.
Oh, thank you so much, Karla, for that nice introduction. And thank you so much, Chelsea, for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you, Juliana, and thank you, Karla, for your warm introduction. And I am so happy to be in conversation today with Juliana, of course, but also under the aegis of the Rosalind Franklin Society.
So can you tell us, just to get started, a little bit about how the original She Persisted book came about, and then we can move into the Women in Science book?
Yeah, thank you, Juliana. So the first She Persisted book came about because 2 sort of phenomenon in my life intersected. One was I was breastfeeding my second child, watching on C-SPAN, because that's just how I roll. When Senator Mitch McConnell and the largely male Republican caucus in the Senate effectively quieted Senator Elizabeth Warren as she was trying to read a letter from the great Coretta Scott King that Mrs. King had written more than 30 years previously. So this was in January of 2017, concerning the nomination at the time of Jeff Sessions to the federal bench. And Senator Warren thought that it was always the right time to hear from Mrs. King, especially as relates to kind of such an important position as the Attorney General, which at the time Jeff Sessions had been nominated for. And afterward, when being interviewed, Mitch McConnell cast himself as the victim of this moment when Senator Warren she wouldn't stop. She kept going. They told her it was, not fitting with decorum. They asked her to sit down. She wouldn't be silent. Finally, like they were forced into censoring her. And, yet nevertheless, she persisted. And I don't think that the Senate Majority Leader had any inkling of kind of how that phrase would be so galvanizing to so many women, and thankfully also some men. And as I was watching all of this unfold in real time, just kept thinking about how often we've needed women, including Senator Warren and including Mrs. King, and, far, far beyond, to persist throughout American history to help advance and protect progress. And kind of the second phenomenon was, as a mom at the time of a daughter and a son, and now I have a second son, I was keenly aware of how many children's books were written from the perspective of boys, or in which the main characters were gendered male, even the animals, which always felt quite strange to me. Like, why are so many of the toads or the pigs or the frogs or the cows or the ducks, like, why are they always often inevitably kind of given male voices and kind of given kind of conventionally boy characteristics, even though they're farm animals. And I found that really challenging as the mother of a daughter. I also found it really challenging as the mother of a son. And so I purposely went looking for books written by women, written kind of centering girls, written kind of with girl main characters, human and animal alike. And thankfully there were some wonderful books, but it just felt like there needed to be so many more. And so these two phenomenon kind of collided in my head and my heart. And I was like, I should do something about this. And my wonderful editor, with whom I had already worked on kind of other projects, also, I think, was feeling like we needed to be doing more to kind of have women's stories for even our youngest readers. And so we decided quickly to work on the first She Persisted together. And I'm so thankful that Alexandra Boignier, who's a just extraordinary illustrator, agreed to work with us on the project. And so that's the story of the first book.
Yeah, absolutely. The illustrations, I'm glad that you mentioned her because they're just absolutely tremendous.
She's brilliant. She's so brilliant and she's so wonderful. And I couldn't imagine these books without her partnership.
And before we dive into the book on women in science, I want to share just a very quick story to let you know that the books really are making such an impact because my youngest is 6. And she came home from school the other day and we read these books and the phrase "she persisted" is, a common one that's spoken in our household. And she said that she didn't want to finish her cheese sandwich at school before having her cookie. And I said, well, you need to eat your growing food. And she said, don't worry, Mom, I persisted.
Oh my gosh. I love that so much.
So from cheese sandwiches to changing the world,
Well, yeah. I mean, if you're healthier, you can do even more world changing.
There you go. So now, I mean, from the original book, the first one, there's so many different directions that you could go in from there. So I'm curious, why did you choose women in science to focus on?
I loved science as a kid. I was completely fascinated by the natural world. I was completely fascinated kind of by everything beyond our planet and always loved science class. I loved all of my science classes in high school and college. And so many of the people that I found most compelling were people who had worked in sciences. And my daughter wants to be a marine biologist when she grows up. She's loved sharks basically her whole life. When she was 2 years old, if you asked her what her favorite animal was, she would say sharks. And she's now 7. If you ask her what her favorite animal is, she still says sharks. And I mean, I even found one of my friends sent me some shark workbook pages that I printed out for her to do over the weekend. And she was like, Mom, I already know all this. I was like, oh, sorry. Just trying to be helpful. And she quickly gave them to her younger brother, who was eager to learn more because he thinks the center of the universe is not the sun, but his big sister. So for reasons kind of relating to my own childhood and reasons relating to kind of what I saw in my own kids, and also reasons relating to the truly countless children that I had interviewed and interacted with for my books written for slightly older audiences, I just know how much so many kids, not all kids, but so many kids love science, even if they may not know that what they love relates to science. And so I just thought, this is a book I want to write. And I knew that there were women I really had to include, admittedly, just because of my kind of personal connection or kind of what I saw my children really kind of gravitate toward. And then I asked some of my friends who are scientists, for their suggestions of who kind of they might want to see included. And so it was a really wonderful iterative process of how we wound up with the 13 women in the book.
Okay. So Chelsea, there are thousands of women that could be included in a book celebrating women of science. So I can only imagine how hard it was to narrow it down. So how hard was it and what was that process like?
It was really hard. It was important to me to include a diversity of disciplines, even though Of course, we couldn't include every discipline. And there were some people that I really wanted to include that I got a little bit of pushback from. Like, I really wanted to include Zaha Hadid, who's an architect, because architecture is also a science. And I want kids to understand there's truly science all around us. What science can help us understand about our local parks or our kind of the nature around us, but also our built environment. And it's really important to me to include Gladys West because my children are fascinated by her. I think because they can't believe there was ever a time that we got lost. That's a very strange concept to them, that like when I was their age and would be on road trips with grandma and papa, we would have maps, but sometimes we'd have to stop and ask for directions because like we have like phones that are also effectively maps in our pockets. So, there were some women that I really wanted to include. And then I really asked a wide kind of group of people, some of whom I knew, some of whom my editor knew, for suggestions of different scientists that they would want to see in the book.
Okay, terrific. Yeah, I really appreciated going through the different women, as somebody who worked in the lab, was doing bench science, how it was such a wide perspective on what science is really. It's not just people that are working at the bench. It's not just life sciences. You have women from so many different walks of science. And I think, especially for kids, I think that's such an important point that the women represent. So I really appreciated that myself.
Julianna, thank you for saying that. I think so, because of course I want kids to think, well, maybe, I'm really inspired by, Dr. Flossie Wong's Stahl story. And I do want to grow up and study diseases and work in a lab to help use science to enable kind of the world to have better diagnostics, better vaccines, better treatments for different diseases. And also maybe I am fascinated by animals like Jane Goodall, and I want to use science to better understand kind of how animals communicate and relate to one another, because that is important and interesting in and of itself. It also may help us in turn learn something more about the human experience. And so I wanted there to be, real representation of kind of what science can be, because I think that it is important for kids to understand why science matters, like why what they're learning in second grade or fourth grade, or even earlier in kindergarten or later in high school, can be enabling in so many different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, including climate change as well, and in climate change activism. So yeah, everything's, that was what prompted that question, because it's also important. Right. So actually to that point, is there anyone or even a discipline, I guess, that after the book was printed and on the shelves that you said, oh, I wish that we put that person in? Anyone that was left on the cutting room floor?
Not really left on the cutting room floor, but I did. I do feel badly that I didn't include a marine biologist for my daughter, I admit, since that's what she wants to be when she grows up. But that's more of a personal regret for her.
Well, maybe the next book.
Yes, thank you. Maybe the next one.
So some of these women have been turned into chapter books. So how did you decide to do the chapter books, and who would turn into a chapter book?
So when I have been on the book tours, admittedly not for the last two books in the She Persisted series, because we have been doing them virtually. So I guess when I was on the book tour for She Persisted Around the World, and then when I was on kind of virtual book events for She Persisted in Sports, especially kind of those two, I got so many questions around like, where can I go to learn more about these women? And sometimes there were like really good places to point kids toward. And sometimes there just hadn't really been kind of much written about these women. And so thankfully, because people were also asking those questions of my publisher, we had the chance to turn the first She Persisted book into a series of chapter books. And thankfully, because those did well, we've now been able to write others.
So now you've done picture books and chapter books. So are there any other initiatives up your sleeve? Any next books coming out?
More chapter books. And so in the back of each chapter book, there's a list of suggested ways that young readers can persist in not the image of, that sounds sort of too dramatic, but kind of directly inspired by these remarkable kind of women's lives. And each list is tailored to each woman's story because they persisted, created, achieved, had impacts in such kind of myriad, though all clearly critically important ways. And so, Julianna, I think we're going to, of course, keep doing what we're doing, but also trying to think about, are there ways to collate those kind of persisted lists? Is there a way to, be even more kind of robust in thinking about kind of curriculum than just sort of the various ideas that the authors have offered schools when asked, or that I've offered when I've been asked? And so it's a kind of rambling answer, but a real-time look into, yes, like we are trying to figure out what more we can do with the continued, thankfully, like interest in these kind of women's stories, the interest of young readers to want to feel connected to their stories and want to have impact as inspired by their stories. And so we, of course, will keep kind of bringing more stories into the world kind of through She Persisted. And we're also trying to think about kind of what more we can do to help support young change makers.
Well, that is a very exciting and I think very important initiative, thinking especially about curriculum. I will share that my oldest is in high school, and when he learned about the discovery of the structure of DNA, it was Watson and Crick only. And
Still.
This year, Chelsea, this year. Yes. And he knows, he came home and told me about it because he knows, as my son, how important this is to me. And it was a good realization for me that this work needs to keep going, from picture books to high school
Really?
to college.
I didn't learn about Rosalind Franklin until I was in college. But I had thought, clearly erroneously, that surely something had changed in the last 25 years since I was in high school. Wow, that made me feel quite old, but like 25 years since I was in high school. And yet it's just so disheartening. And yet, as I sit here, I realize not terribly surprising that there hasn't been a change. And I think too, like, I know that the Nobel Committee does not reward Nobels posthumously, but I think we also have to continue to apply pressure to effectively the gatekeepers of achievement, whether the academic journals or kind of the organizations that grant prestigious awards, of course, not as prestigious as the Nobel Prize, but kind of many others, especially in kind of the sciences and math, to be more honest about updating, their history and the stories of what they recognize as achievement and who they have recognized as kind of the driving forces behind those achievements. Because while certainly the structure of DNA may be one of the most egregious efforts to ensure a woman is not given her fair due, it is far from the only.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you talked a little bit about how in your own education, how you took science classes. So I'm just curious a little bit more about your personal interest in science. And were there any women scientists along the way that influenced you in your kind of educational direction or career path?
I mean, I'm so thankful that my freshman advisor at Stanford was a wonderful scientist named Anne Fernald, who studies early language and brain development and early emotional kind of development and fluency in very, very little kids, in babies and early toddlers. Because I think, in my conversations with her my freshman year, when I was trying to figure out, like, what am I going to do with my life? And I had come to realize that I was really interested in kind of in public health, but I didn't quite know how to pursue that. There wasn't a public health major or concentration at Stanford at the time. And it wasn't my only interest I wanted to explore in college. I mean, I wound up taking some, classes that thankfully affirmed like, oh, that is something I want to be a hobby, but not a calling in life. But I think she really helped me understand why, even if I was going to kind of at some point maybe pursue a master's in public health or a doctorate degree, it was still important to have a grounding in the life sciences so that I would have kind of comfort and fluency kind of with those areas of work and literature. I'm so thankful that I took statistics in college and then later took further advanced statistics in graduate school, which was hugely important to my kind of trajectory. And so I am keenly aware of how lucky, how serendipitous it was that Dr. Fernald was my freshman advisor, because she really helped me understand kind of what building blocks would be helpful, even if there wasn't kind of the degree that I would have wanted. And I think that kind of figure it outness, or whatever the right framing is, and that, but with a heavy, thankfully, caring, but heavy dose of like mentorship and guidance, was really important to me.
Right. Taking that interest in public health, your graduate studies, what was your goal then in going and doing the graduate studies at the Mailman School?
So my interest in public health really started with Magic Johnson when he, in November of 1991, declared that he was HIV positive, which was a hugely courageous, it should not have required courage, but at the time was a hugely courageous decision. And that got me really interested first in HIV and AIDS, and then in stigma, and then in the kind of policies and structures that either were helping to protect or candidly make people more vulnerable to HIV infection, failing to deliver treatment. And so when I was in college, the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria was created towards the end of my time in college. And I was fascinated as to why the world felt the need to create a new instrument. And what did that say about the failures of the pre-existing kind of global health architecture? So I first went to get a master's in international relations with a public health focus, global public health focus. And I wrote my master's thesis on the Global Fund and its genesis. And the first time I thought about getting a PhD was then. Juliana, maybe you can kind of have some empathy for this perspective. When I was like 22 or 23 and thinking about applying to PhD programs, it just felt inconceivable to me. I was going to then be like 28, know a whole lot about one thing. And like, what was I going to know about the rest of the world felt really daunting to me. And so I decided to not pursue a PhD at that point in time. Went and worked in consulting and then in finance. And then realized by this point, very different than kind of a decade before, there really was now formal training kind of in public health that had emerged, and a real emphasis on kind of global public health had really also kind of become a core tenet of schools of public health, at least here in the Northeast. So I went and I got my MPH, but with a kind of specific focus on, I set about to learn some very specific things. And then I went back and did my doctorate focused on looking at the first 10 years of the Global Fund and whether or not it had lived up to its expectations or not. That was a way longer answer than you wanted. But despite kind of my college experience trying to cobble together things that I thought would be important and useful and also interesting kind of for my later life, my graduate studies after that all had very specific kind of purpose and direction to them.
Yeah. And then I think my last question is really just about kind of taking all of that scientific background and as it's brought you to today. What do you see for the future as far as your top priorities? I know you're vice chair of the Clinton Foundation, or other roles that you hold, and kind of, putting that science and using it in the future goals.
Well, I hope, Juliana, I hope that I have the chance to just keep doing what I'm doing and just keep doing more of what I'm doing. I'm so thankful that I get to manifest, at least for me, the two most kind of important callings to me in a professional sense, as an author, as an academic, as an advocate, as a mentor, to just do kind of anything and everything I can to kind of further advance kind of good public health and all that means for as many people in as many places as possible. To me, that also really ties to doing anything and everything I can to support women and kids' health. And I'm so proud of all the work that we do around the world with the Clinton Health Access Initiative to do just that. And also here in the United States with a real focus in early childhood development and early brain development for kids. And I also hope I get to keep writing more She Persisted books and having conversations like this, and that I continue to have the chance to have conversations also anchored around kind of public health and supporting women and girls, in my podcast, that I'm able to keep teaching, that I'm able to keep kind of investing in and supporting and championing, not only women, but especially women who are tackling challenges as relates to public health, whether that's something you mentioned earlier, kind of the intersection of public health and climate change, or kind of the intersection of public health and women's rights, or the intersection of kind of public health and like access to education. And so that is what I hope that I just keep being able to do all that I'm doing now, because I feel so grateful for the opportunities I have now to try to help in whatever small ways I can change the world.
Absolutely. Well, from one woman in science to another woman in science, thank you so much first of all, for joining us today. And second of all, for all of the work that you're doing, because, the phrase "you have to see it to be it" exists for a reason. And, myself growing up, we never had these stories. We didn't know these stories that you've really just put into so many children's hands and elementary school kids' hands. And so I am a huge fan of the books and a fan of the work. And so thank you.
Oh, well, Juliana, thank you. Yes, I see that impact just also, as you were saying, what you see in your house, I see it in my house too. I mean, my 5-year-old loves math and music kind of beyond anything. And so, if you were to ask him like who his heroes are, he would say Katherine Johnson and Beethoven. And I think that's pretty great that my 5-year-old, who's a boy, doesn't think anything about the fact that he now has these 2 heroes that he looks up to, one of whom was a woman. That is just very unexceptional to him in a really exceptional way, for me as his mom to see. And so I just want to keep kind of trying to bring that reality into force, into being, for as many kids as possible.
Yes. And also I want to leave on a positive note as well, as far as the schools go, because my other son watched Hidden Figures in school and came home full of what amazing stories of women in science that tells.
Yes. And there's a wonderful children's book called Counting on Catherine that I have no doubt my 5-year-old has memorized every single word and every single number in.
Well, terrific. Well, thank you again for doing the work, because it's much appreciated.
Also, just want to again thank the Rosalind Franklin Society for not only fighting for her rightful place in history, but helping to support women in science today, because we still need extra support for women in science.
Thank you both. This is just wonderful. Chelsea, you have added to the inspiration that we're going to share worldwide with women and others in science. And it really is so terrific that you are using your platform, your education, your children, and the ability to share this important work and perspective. So thank you for doing it. And
Thank you so much.
Just urge you to continue. And I know that we will continue to share the work that you're doing, the chapter books, and the other work that you do as well. So we are with you. If there is in the future any role we can play to help promote what you're doing, you don't strike me as a bashful person. And if I run into you or your parents in downtown Chappaqua or the dog park or anywhere, we can follow up on more conversation.
Please. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Have a good one.